Wait, is this a follow-up to the Pyramids episode or the Kink episode?
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact, and enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis. Welcome to Occultae Veritatis podcast. I'm Miriam, and I'm back for another episode on some cool Egyptian shit.
Yeah, and we also have some people that are guessing with us, including me, Ood Gallifrey.
Sage Murray.
Misfit.
Squishy.
And Brannigan.
Yeah, this is kind of an impromptu recording. We have a few of our patrons in here, so we're going to learn about some Egyptian shit. But first, what's your poison?
So, what's your poison?
I've got a cup of old warm iced tea.
It's upsetting.
It really is.
How old and how warm?
2 days in room temperature.
Is it still iced tea at that point if there isn't ice in it?
It's lukewarm tea.
Doesn't have the same ring to it.
I have nothing. My poison is nothing.
I'm drinking iced coffee because I love coffee more than I sleep.
Me too.
So for me, I'm drinking a store-brand Diet Cola because with as much soda as I drink, it might as well be diet.
What is the store brand?
That would be Super Chill.
Super Chill Cola. I like it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm drinking the cheapest coffee I could find at Walmart with a little bit of hazelnut creamer in it, so it's delightful.
At least it's not fucking dollar store coffee like last time. Ugh.
Hey, that dollar store coffee had more caffeine in it than my Walmart coffee. I miss when the dollar store had that coffee.
The worst, though, is spa coffee.
Oh, yeah, I guess, hey.
The cheapest brand that whoever could afford, and then it's made in, like, a really cheap coffee maker.
When I was doing a food delivery thing, I used to sneak into the bank and fill my entire thermos with their coffee, because the bank coffee was good.
Oh,
That's
nice.
not where I expected a sentence that started, I used to sneak into a bank to finish with.
No kidding.
That's not the most exciting. It's a nice heist, but it's not the most exciting one I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
That bank also had its vault open during daytime hours, but I just took a right turn and went right to the coffee machine. That's the heist I'm ready for.
Priority.
They're testing you. They're like, yeah, look, it's open. Yeah, come on in.
Yeah, sometimes banks leave their vault open so that you can get to your safe deposit box, family jewels or secret documents or...
You know, having the vault open, I realize it's probably done for convenience, but like it would make me feel less special going to the bank. Like I want to see the big I want to see the big metal door open.
Big
for
reveal.
Me.
Oh, Mr. Gallifrey, you're here for your safe deposit box. Let me open the vault for you.
And I want a 10-minute montage of unwinding things, like little clicky things happening.
Or they have to go get a second person because they need two sets. I mean, it probably is like two sets of keys. They just don't want to have the two people there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it should be a production.
It takes like an ounce of teller blood to like open the door. That's how you really know that the teller is opening it.
Yes.
Can you give us a technical definition of what a mummy is? Maybe we should start there.
Well, a mummy is any body that something has happened to it, either by natural occurrence or by something that's been done by a culture that will take that dead body and it slows or inhibits the natural decay process, and so therefore it's preserved.
Mummies never decay. Is that true?
No. They will eventually fall apart, but depending on whether they stay in their natural environment. If they stay in their natural environment, or that particular unique environment, if they stay in that environment, they will survive for thousands of years. But if that environment changes, then we will lose things. So, like this example that we see right here, this is an Egyptian mummy that has been removed from the sand, and when it was removed from the sand, it began to smolder. It actually, the oxygen, the exposure to the oxygen, caused the bitumen, the tar-like substance, to begin to smolder. It actually caught on fire. So you have to work on that mummy really fast once you've removed it to be able to learn things from it before it's gone.
Well, you mentioned that you also learn from the artifacts that a person can be buried with sometimes. So what about the trappings that mummies are buried with? Do they survive?
Yes. That's one of the other great things about mummies is not only does the tissue survive, but all of the materials that would be with that person, whether it was things that were given as gifts to the person or clothing that they were wearing. And so, like, we have examples of, like, the coffin here, but there's cloth materials. And we have here, as example here, these are from Peru, and these are pieces of clothing that come from, and a netting that would have been used for probably fishing or something like that.
This right here.
Yeah, and then also in front there, they were woven to have particular designs. In many instances, those designs were specifically made for burial. Where mummies are buried? All over the world. Mummies are found all over the world.
Really?
Yeah. Most of us think about Egyptian mummies, but as I said, a mummy or a body, a desiccated body or a dehydrated body, can be found anywhere in the world.
Today we're talking about mummification, but first we're going to talk about what that word came from. And we're going to learn a long way through this story that there were just a bunch of misconceptions and misunderstandings that led to the modern conception of what people think a mummy is. And this is just like one of the first ones that occurred. So, explorers from Arabia made a trip in the 7th century to explore Egypt. And when they went there, they discovered tens of thousands of mummies, because Egyptians had been doing this for years and years and years, mummifying their dead. And the Persian word that was used to describe the mummies came from bitumen. And the word that they used, kind of a slang term for bitumen, mum, was used to describe the mummies, because they were convinced that these mummies were wrapped in this bitumen to be preserved. Oh, bitumen is the same as asphalt. But they weren't covered by asphalt. But ancient Persians thought they were, so they just called them mum, and that turned into the modern form mummy. Also, this episode is super exciting because I finally learned the difference between marshes, swamps, fens, and bogs.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah, Hope you guys are sitting down for this.
Common misconception. People think they're the same thing.
I thought they were the same thing until I reached to this episode. I thought they were just like synonyms.
No, I knew bogs were different and swamps were different. No, some of those other ones were different.
Is it something to do with like the acidity in the soil or something like that?
That's exactly what it has to do with.
Oh, wow. I was kind of guessing.
Yes. So before we get into the Egyptian flavor mummies with Miriam, we're going to talk about some other ways that mummification happens. And some of it is bog mummies. So marshes are at the edges of lakes and streams. Sometimes they have trees, lots of grass, and they have fresh flowing water all the time because they're at the edges of these lakes and streams. A swamp has lots of trees. The water is murky and stagnant, so it doesn't get as much flow and cycling as a marsh, but it still has access to fresh water, so that fresh water still gets cycled in and out. A fen forms when groundwater flows into a depression, so the water comes from the ground and leaks up onto the surface to form like this swamp-like area, but it again gets fresh water from this underground water source. So all three of those, marshes, swamps, and fens, get some access to fresh water. Bogs don't. A bog is formed when the flow of fresh water stops, and the water just sits there, sometimes for thousands and thousands of years. And the rotting stuff that's in that water starts to decay, and it decays to a point where the water gets super acidified to the point where bacterial life can't live in it. Has anybody here ever brewed like beer or wine or meat or anything like that?
No.
I've done a little mead.
Bogs preserve stuff sort of for the same reason that like brewing stuff kills the bacteria. Like as you're brewing mead or wine or alcohol or beer or whatever, there's a point where the little yeasties, the little buddies eating all the sugar in there and pooping alcohol, there's a point where they've pooped so much in their own home that they die from it. The same thing happens in bogs. So much decay happens that soon the water becomes inhospitable to bacterial life. And if stuff falls into it, it just doesn't rot. Because rotting happens when animals or bacteria starts to wear away at something. But if you're in an area where those things can't survive, rotting just won't happen. And that's where bog mummies are formed.
That's wild.
Yeah, the human body is full of bacteria, and basically the decay process is because all the bacteria in your body, there's no way for your living system to combat it. So it just keeps eating all of the flesh and cells inside your body. And that's why the body bloats when you die.
Yeah, and when they dig up bog bodies and they do like 3D scans of them, they'll find that at their center, they're partially decomposed. So the bacteria, like Miriam said, the bacteria inside them started to decompose the body, but soon the bacteria ran out of all the resources they needed to continue their life cycles, and they were unable to continue decomposing. In regular bodies of water with fresh water flowing in and out, those bacteria would get what they need to continue decomposing, but in bog bodies, they decompose a little bit in the center of these mummies, and then they just die out like the body does.
Old Crawhan Man is one of hundreds of Iron Age mummies found scattered in the bogs of northern Europe. Growlbowl Man, throat slit from ear to ear. Eat-a Girl, strangled and stabbed. Virding Men, stabbed and disemboweled. By all appearances, most met a violent end. Many saw these mummies as criminals, executed for crimes against society. But today, archaeologists see something far more complex. A harsh world wrought with uncertainty, foreign invasion, and premature death. This is the story of little-known rituals from a pre-Christian time, superstitions, and what to us is the most taboo of rites, human sacrifice. The bog bodies themselves hold the answers. The bog bodies are accidental mummies, preserved in layers of peat formed by the bog. Christian Fischer, director of the Silkeborg Museum in Denmark, thinks that understanding the bog is crucial to figuring out what happened to the mummies.
Here we have a really good example of how the bog was built or how the bog was before. Most part of it was cut away during this period of peat cutting here. We put on 2 to 4 millimeters every year, and you could follow it down. You could see these different kind of layers representing wet periods, warm period of our climate. And when you reach the bottom of the bog, you are perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years behind now. Here we have the sphagnum moss, and while it lives, it gives a little bit of acids which come down into the bog water, and altogether makes the bog water acid containing, and in a complicated way, it makes the bog water antiseptic, so we can preserve. So this sphagnum is really the secret behind the bog bodies.
6 to 8 feet down is the Iron Age layer, where most of the bodies are found. The bodies became mummies through a complicated process. Many of them were placed in shallow graves. Cold water seeped in rapidly, and people probably covered the corpse further with peat. Once immersed, the body was preserved by bacteria-killing acid, courtesy of the sphagnum moss in the water. Layers of plants sealed the body into an oxygen-free world.
Another type of mummification is natural mummification. So if you're part of a culture or a people that live near a desert and you have your graveyards in the desert, sometimes just doing that will be enough to mummify people. But if there isn't enough moisture for bacteria to start to breed and form, sometimes decay just won't happen. Funny thing about the Sahara Desert is a lot of desert cultures, when they bury their dead naturally become mummified anyway because there's not much moisture in the desert and in the desert sand. But the Sahara Desert is actually even more suited towards that because it's rich in a mineral called natron. And natron is sort of like baking soda, and it'll basically wick moisture away from the body and disinfect the body, meaning kill any bacteria on the body, just by being buried within it. So the Sahara Desert is actually better at creating natural mummies just from people being buried within it, even other deserts.
Yeah. So did you know that Sahara is from the Arabic word that means desert? So it's the desert.
Nice.
Man, let's go to the desert.
I mean, it really is desert. It is the most desert of all deserts, in my opinion, but I'm not an expert.
I've seen pictures. It's very desert.
Yeah.
It's strange, too. I didn't mention it much in the Bronze Age collapse episode or the human evolution episode, but the Sahara Desert keeps on going in between being a desert and being a luscious jungle paradise. Every 50,000 years, it'll switch over.
It's wild to think about. Just kind of like thinking about the Ice Age and thinking about everything being covered in ice once upon a time, and it's all just gone.
Like, the only reason that Middle-land Canada and Middle-land America is flat is because the glaciers scraped them flat. I'd be under a couple hundred feet of ice if it was a little while ago.
Yeah.
Speaking of a couple hundred feet of ice, that's the next kind of mummy, an icy or cold burial. So there's another way to trap moisture away from bacteria. If you go to a desert, there isn't much moisture because the heat has made it such that the moisture has dried up and evaporated. If you're in an icy environment, it's trapped in solid form. Bacteria can't do much with water in solid form. They really need liquid water to propagate in. So if you live in a cold environment and you bury your dead there, bacteria also might not propagate. It's the same reason why you don't get bacterial growth in your freezer. A prime example of this is Occultae the Iceman. 5,000 years ago, somebody murdered him in cold blood by shooting him in the back with an arrow, and he fell into a shallow, but very cold and dry grave. His body, his lips, even his last meal was preserved in that weather.
Wasn't he in such good condition when they found him, they thought he was a more recent death? Started a police investigation?
There were some early reports that he was just 10 or 20 years old, but dressed really strangely. And it wasn't until archaeologists came in and found that he had a bunch of Bronze Age implements. They said, no, this is an ancient man. It's still a fucking murder, though. We're going to do that episode at some point. We're going to solve the mystery of Occultae the Iceman's murder.
We're going to start with the man of the hour, Occultae the Iceman, one of the world's most famous mummies. You might be wondering, how did we know his name? It's a really good question. I'm asked that question very often. If you look up on the wall, you'll see the spelling. First, he was just the Iceman, because this mummy was found buried in ice. But then came the nickname Ötzi, because he was found in the Ötztal Alps, which is a range that spans from Austria down into Italy. Ötzi the Iceman was found in Italy by some hikers who happened to be on vacation. The hikers who found him were Erica and Helmut Simon. They were advanced hikers and decided to go on a path that normally hikers did not travel on, and it was a very warm season the summer before. And that September day, in the distance, they saw part of Ötzi's head sticking up out of a glacier. What we're seeing here is more exposure of his body than Erica and Helmut actually saw. They saw just the top of his head, barely exposed. From what I've read, they went over because they thought what they saw was a piece of trash. And it turned out it was actually a human head. Probably a big surprise. I don't know what you would do if that was your find on the mountainside, but I think I'd be terrified. Well, they went and found the park rangers who confirmed that this did indeed look like the body of a human stuck in the ice. And everyone was pretty sure this was probably just a poor, unfortunate hiker who went missing in the mountains, which apparently is quite common on this range. So they proceeded to try to remove the body from the ice with drills. Well, drilling was not a very good idea because poor Ötzi's body was damaged. I'll be showing you the damage later. What they wound up having to do was try to melt the ice around his body, which took several days. And while they were melting the ice around his body, they started to find some of his belongings, things that he had with him when he died on the mountain. We have replicas here in our exhibit of his belongings, including his clothing and some of the things he had been carrying with him before he died. One of the most fantastic things that he was carrying was this axe. So what's so special about the axe? The axe is made of a handle that comes from a yew tree. And yew wood is very, very strong and does not secrete a lot of sap, that sticky stuff that comes out of wood when you cut it. So it's a good material for a handle. It's not going to get sticky. But what was really impressive was the metal that was used on this axe, almost 100% copper. This is important. This tells us a little bit about when he lived. So there was a period of time that you may have heard of called the Copper Age, which started in the Middle East, the use of copper to make tools, and moved into Europe. And the fact that he had a copper axe told us a little bit about maybe when the Copper Age began in Europe, where he came from. We'll come back to this. So don't forget, copper, very important. We think that Ötzi the Iceman may have actually smelted this copper himself. So smelting is when the metal is removed from rock. You have to make it very, very hot. And when you do this, arsenic is actually released into the air. And he had high levels of arsenic in his hair that was analyzed after the body was removed from the ice. And he also had arsenic in his lungs. He had been breathing it. So this might have been a man who was not just a hunter, but was also a smelter of metal, and maybe a man of stature in his community. A well-rounded man of many skills.
The last type of mummy I'll talk about before I hand it off to Miriam is the on-purpose type of mummification. So you have the mummification that comes from being in a bog, you have the mummification that comes from burying somebody in a desert or somebody in an icy location, and some of those are partially on purpose. Like maybe the people that are burying bodies in the desert know that they're mummifying them by burying them in sand, but these are all the very on purpose, like they mean to preserve people. One example of this is mummies from the Canary Islands. So when you died in the Canary Islands and they selected you for mummification, they would eviscerate you. Eviscerate is a fancy word for having all your organs scooped out. You're covered in butter, literal butter, and then you're placed on the beach and fried in the sunlight until your body is nice and dry and crisp. They pretty much just deep fry you in the sun until you're totally bone dry, and that's how they mummify you.
Delicious.
Yes, delicious.
Nice.
Horrifying.
Yeah, they fry you to the point past being delicious. This isn't like crispy bacon delicious. This is like unchewable ligament, like dry. But
beef jerky.
Yeah.
Except like the really shitty dollar store jerky that you can barely chew.
Your instincts are totally correct, though, because there's some stage within that where it would be just delicious, I think. But I don't suspect that they stop there very much. Another one is in Siberia. So the bodies again are eviscerated, emptied of organs. They were then stitched back up and wrapped in this rope made of horsehair. And then they were put in shallow graves filled with stones. And they knew that if they left them there for like 10 years, the body would basically mummify in that cold earth. The best preserved on-purpose mummy, arguably in the world, is somebody called Lady Di. She died in 163 BCE. So 163 BC, more than 2,000 years ago, she was bathed in pure mercury, which can serve to interrupt bacteria life cycles, so it might have killed bacteria and made her toxic enough that bacteria couldn't grow. They put her inside an airtight coffin, and they nested that airtight coffin in 5 other airtight coffins, like a Russian nesting doll of airtight coffins. And then it was encased in layers of charcoal and clay, and then it was buried 50 feet underground. And when they unearthed her, her flesh was still flexible enough to manipulate. Her veins still had some liquid blood in them. And this is a lady from 163 BCE.
Yeah, that's crazy. And just to think that they were even able to do that in 163 BC is mind-boggling.
Oh yeah, it's one of those like big if true claims. Like the level of specification that they would have to do to airtight seal all that with technology from the Iron Age is like but maybe, who knows?
When did you say she was found?
I don't remember when she was unearthed. I think she was unearthed a couple hundred years ago, like in the 1700s, I believe.
Gotcha.
Hey, Editing Ood here. It wasn't a couple hundred years ago. It was in 1968. Her tomb, along with the tomb of her family members, was discovered when an air raid shelter was being dug below a hospital. Back to the show. The most infamous form of mummy, the mummies that people picture most when they say the word mummy, are probably Egyptian-style mummies, and I'll hand it off to Miriam to talk all about that.
The Egyptian mummies are probably the most famous, and they've got one of the most elaborate mummification rituals, and that's because there was such a focus in ancient Egypt on the afterlife and how it was just your second life. It wasn't just the life you're living right now. After you died, you had a second life in the afterworld. And so the purpose of mummification was really to preserve the body so that you could have the same body you were living in the afterlife. They would preserve the body. They had the natron, like Ood said, and they would make sure that every part of your body was preserved, except for the brain, because that's useless, right? Who even needs a brain? So
I don't use mine much, so.
I don't either. I think one of the things that's unique about Egyptian society, though, is that anybody could have been mummified. It was pretty expensive because of the amount of work that was involved in it, but you could get mummified if you were rich or if you're poor, if you had enough mummy money.
Mummy money.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
So was this like a middle class and up thing, or did the lower classes have access to mummification as well?
Yeah, the lower classes had access to it. It's just you had to have some kind of money for it because there was a lot of work involved in it, and you had priests who would bless the body, and you had specialists who would go in and perform the actual mummification process. They would perform an embalming process. If you were royalty, basically your body was preserved in the same way that they believed Osiris's body was preserved to make your body perfect and ready to go into the afterlife. The cheapest was obviously, we'll dry out your body and make sure that your body doesn't look like crap when you go into the afterlife. But there wasn't the same amount of effort put into it.
When you bang that thing up the soon-to-be mummy's nose, if they're royalty, you might take your time and really make sure that you were careful not to distort like the shape of the face. But if they were more
discount mummery,
yeah,
right, yeah. If you were poor, you were more likely to have like the brain left intact instead of having really nice canisters for your organs. They would just go into regular clay jars with maybe a face drawn on them so that they knew what was actually in there. Issue with the actual process of mummification is there wasn't a lot of it left over, the repeated conquest of ancient Egypt. So while we have a lot of information about how they did the process and the religious reasoning behind it, the actual process, the physical means of doing the mummification isn't really there. So a lot of the details we kind of rely on people like Herodotus. So he described the 3 different levels of mummification. So those are in order from best to least best. You have the most elaborate, which is reserved for royalty. You remove the brains and many internal organs first. Then you take all of the guts out You fill the empty cavity with a variety of aromatic spices. Then you stitch the body back up. Then you cover them in salt for 70 days to remove all the moisture. And then you wrap it up in linen, you wash it. They covered it in sticky resin. And I think that's where the mum came from, why they thought it was bitumen. In Arabic, it's mumia. So that's kind of why we call them mummies. So they applied the sticky resin to make sure the bandages adhered to the body. And then they gave the corpse back to the relatives. And the relatives put it in the coffin. So obviously, if you're royalty, you get prayer said over your body and you go into a special grave. You have everything prepared for the afterlife. And I kind of went over this in the pyramids episode, but you'll have a very elaborate grave. You'll have all the things you want in the afterlife, including mummified servants and mummified animals if you want. Yes, the Egyptians also mummified animals. They mummified their pets, cats, dogs, rabbits, crocodiles. Once the coffin was closed, once all the burials were done, they put it in the burial chamber, and now your body is ready for the afterlife. Most, if not all, of the mummies in their sarcophagus, there were eyes drawn on the coffin, and they faced east. And I think it was because that's where, the sun rises. The eyes were drawn on the coffin so that the body could look east.
How long did mummification typically take?
In the most elaborate mummification process, just the removal of moisture took about 70 days. So it was probably at least 2.5 month, maybe 3 month process. If you don't have a lot of money, it's not going to be as long of a process. So it may be a really short process where they just quickly remove the organs, maybe leave the brain inside. But whatever you could afford was how long the process took and how much effort they put into the preservation.
You said they filled their insides with fragrant spices and stuff. Was that more of a floral thing to, give them a good smell? Or did it have, cultural and religious significance?
A lot of it was cultural and religious significance. So things like myrrh and cassia were put in there. When we think about the Bible story of the 3 wise men who come over to visit the baby Jesus, they bring things like frankincense and myrrh. And those were seen as very important spices in the ancient world. They're very expensive and they were used in religious practices. If you were very rich, you could afford things like myrrh and fragrance. God damn it.
You got this.
My face is not working today. Okay, you can afford things like myrrh and frankincense, but if you're poor, you may just get the tiniest sprinkle of myrrh or something like that. You were looking to get these expensive and religious spices and herbs to put in your body to make it smell good, to be part of that burial process. There's not a whole lot that goes into the deep religious significance of why they put those herbs and spices in there, possibly to make them tasty for when the British ate my ancestors, but, it's anybody's guess.
Beneath the wrapping, a 2,000-year-old amulet protects the deceased from the dangers of the afterlife.
Now, when they were wrapping the body, they would also put amulets, protective amulets, all around the body, both in the front and also in the back, that would help the body achieve an afterlife. And what's quite nice is that some of these amulets are tied into things in the Book of the Dead. So you know that they are there to protect the body against specific perils that they're going to meet on the way through to the other side of the afterlife.
Let's see, the mask was on...
But why did the ancient Egyptians go through the trouble of preserving their dead to begin with?
The ancient Egyptians mummified their dead because they believed that the soul really needed a more physical vehicle to enjoy all of the sort of physical delights of the afterlife. And so they used to mummify bodies, which meant preserving them so that they could be used by the soul to go back into the body, which would be perfectly preserved, and then could enjoy, food, drink, anything else that the afterlife had to offer.
But mummification was just the beginning to a long journey. A journey for the soul of the deceased. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead was the only guide to a life beyond the grave.
When you die and you are getting to the afterlife. The journey in between is very perilous. And the deceased spirit, before they were reborn forever, had to go through a series of tests. And the Book of the Dead provides answers and protection against the perils of the journey.
The Book of the Dead was a costly proposition, and the decision to purchase one was a difficult and complicated process. There were 186 spells to choose from, and a scroll would be produced based on a person's needs or budget. The priests of the temple would help a person choose which spells would be needed in the afterlife.
So I think we went over the most elaborate type of mummification. What were the other two?
The other two, it was just varying levels of cheapness of the mummification process. So you had obviously the royal mummification process, which is the most elaborate. Then you have I guess you could call it the middle class mummification process, where you would get the organs removed, you would get the brain removed, and they may say prayers over your body. They would put you in a whatever coffin or sarcophagus that your family could afford, and then you would go into the burial chamber. The poorest people could maybe only afford cheapest kinds of aromatic spices. Maybe they couldn't afford any aromatic spices. They might just leave the brain in, or they might leave some of the internal organs in, just because they were hurrying through the process. And so if you couldn't afford a fancy burial, you may not even be able to afford mummification. The difference is in how much effort they put into actually removing organs, and the salt is the most important part. The less important parts are things like the prayer said over the body and the herbs and spices that go into it. They may spend less time. They may not do as good a job of trying to preserve the features of the body. It's really just how much care they put into the process. It's not going to be the kind of fanciest burial. It wouldn't be the same kind of mummification process that you think of when you think of King Tut, where he just had funerary masks and all kinds of amulets wrapped in with the linens. And sometimes when they buried royalty, they would paint realistic eyes and a face on the topmost layers of linen and have a really elaborate funerary mask placed on it so that, your body really knew, oh, this is me. So after your soul was traveling in the afterlife, when it came back, it was like, oh, this is me. Okay, that's my body. And instead of getting confused and being like, whose body is this? Is this mine? Like when you lose your car in the parking lot, you're clicking it, trying to hear it. I can imagine some ancient spirit clicking the mummy key, like, boop, that's my body. Where did I leave my body? The discovery of King Tut's tomb really shed light on all of that, where we were able to see, oh my God, he really had everything he needed set up in the afterlife. He had servants, he had animals, they would put food and chairs, boats for them to travel down the Nile in the afterlife. And it was everything they needed. And
they had boats in that pyramid?
Yeah, boats, chariots, things to go hunting with. I mean, they really believed the afterlife was literally exactly like this life. And so you not only needed a perfectly preserved body, but you needed everything else you would need in this life to have a good life in the afterlife.
Oh, fuck.
They loved boats. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, boats are real important. That whole process, like all the spiritual stuff, not like the nitty-gritty making a mummy, but like the spiritual stuff that they do to send your body on its way.
Oh, yeah. Well, because they lived on the Nile. And so you had desert, and then you had the Nile, and all the livable space is right there on the Nile. So it was a really water-focused culture, even though it was in the desert, because they were on the Nile, and the river was the source of everything.
It flooded on a predictable schedule, so they were able to flood their irrigation networks just like predictably. And not only did it provide like water for their irrigation networks, it also was their source of trade. Like when we talk about gold in the Egyptian south being used throughout the kingdom and all that, it was the Nile that gold was transported down. So it was a source of trade and transportation and food and water for irrigation. It was real important.
One of the most important myths that goes into the actual mummification process came with the Osiris myth. That's where people really believed that, man, mummification is really important. So Osiris was the primary deity in the Old Kingdom, and he ruled with his wife. Isis is how we pronounce it in Arabic, but other people pronounce it Isis. Her Egyptian name is Aset. Osiris and his sister wife, they ruled over Egypt as the mythical first rulers. His brother Set was jealous. Set murdered Osiris, and he sealed him in a coffin, sent him down the Nile River, then hacked his body into pieces and scattered them across Egypt. Isis, she retrieved all of his pieces, reassembled him with the help of her sister Nephthys, and brought him back to life. But he was incomplete because he was missing his penis, which has been eaten by a fish.
I hate it when that happens.
That's canon?
Yeah, that is canon.
Didn't Set ejaculate on a piece of lettuce or something?
Yeah. No, so it's the creation story in ancient Egypt. The god Atum created the world by ejaculating. We're all God spooch. That's all we are.
Namaste to you as well.
Still a better love story than Twilight.
Yeah, exactly. So, because he was incomplete, Osiris could not rule over the living earth, so he had to rule the underworld. That myth became so popular that it infused the entire culture and myths to create that central belief in life after death and the possibility of resurrection of the dead. Osiris is depicted as a mummified ruler. And so if you look at him in hieroglyphs and in these papyrus, he's seen as having a green face, and that's because he's dead. He's a mummy. And so this is how they symbolize he's dead and resurrected, because he's still alive. He's just a mummy. This is how the origin of mummification actually came about, was because people said, hey, if Osiris can come back from the dead, then if we have a complete body, we too can ascend to the afterlife and have this rebirth in the afterlife. Only possible if your body was intact. And so you had all the parts of your body. You had the Khat, your physical body, the Ka, your astral self or your spirit, and you also had to have the Ba, which is your human-headed bird aspect. So that's the one that goes back and forth between the earth and the heavens, which is the afterlife in your body. You have your Shuyet, which is your shadow self, the Ak, the immortal self that's transformed after death, your Sahu, which is an aspect of the Ak, the Sechem, which is another aspect of the Ak, the Ab, which is your heart. This is the source of good and evil and the holder of your character. This was always left in the body. So I forgot to mention that earlier, but your heart is always left in the body because that's where the center of your character, it's where all of your beliefs and good and evil came from. And then you had your Ren, which is your secret name. So everybody had a given name that everybody called you, and then you have a secret name that's given to you at birth that basically only the gods and parents know. You have to have your Khat in full preservation in order to make it to the afterlife. So all those other pieces are considered just standard for a human body. But if your Khat is not present, if you don't have a physical body, then you'll never be able to make it to the afterlife.
And it sounds like that bird head aspect, like that's the little connecting wire between all your different aspects, eh?
Yeah, and so it was like a little bird with a human head, and it would travel to the afterlife at night and go enjoy the afterlife. Whatever you did in life was what you would do in the afterlife, and then in the morning it would come back to the body. So if you didn't have a recognizable body, the ba would not know how to come back. So it would be stuck in the afterlife.
And I can see how it all stems from that Osiris myth, because, you know, he was missing his dick and that made big problems. And so I can see how that would descend to, like, make sure your body is all together, make sure it's recognizable, you know, and you may grant an afterlife as well, you know?
Be that he was green with penis envy.
It's, yes. I mean, everybody else had one but him, so that was kind of a problem.
That's why he made sure he had the biggest onk of all.
Oh, now I get what that beard's for. Osiris, you sneaky fucker.
That's what happens when you don't have a dick. You have to fuck sneakily. And of course, the only way you could actually make it to the afterlife was if you passed the afterlife test. And so this is basically where you're escorted to Mot, the goddess of justice, and she will weigh your heart against a feather. And if your heart weighs more than a feather, then you're considered unworthy, and you will not go to the afterlife. Your soul will be eaten by Ammit, which is a terrifying hippo, lion, I think hippo, lion, crocodile god, and she would eat your soul. So not the adorable, sweet, kind hippo goddess that they had in Moon Knight. Ammit was terrifying.
How do you spell that name?
Ammit.
Oh, okay. My boss's name is Amit, and if it was spelled the same, I was going to be like, hey, I learned something interesting about you this weekend.
To clarify, in Moon Knight, the cute hippo was Tawaret, whereas Ammit was the crocodile meanie.
Does Ammit have a crocodile head?
Yeah, she's got a crocodile head, and in ancient Egyptian mythology, she has a crocodile head. The front part of her body is a lion, and then the back part of her body is a hippo. And they are the three largest man-eating animals known to ancient Egypt. If you think hippos are adorable, they're actually terrifying.
I think they kill more people than most other animals in Africa, I believe. I think they're near the top of the list for, like, murdering humans, you know?
I've seen videos of baby hippos using crocodiles as chew toys, and the crocodile is just like, nope, not going to do anything.
And here I thought all the hippos do were wander around my house and make my energy bill higher.
No, see, those are cute house hippos. House hippos are different. We're talking about wild hippos.
Ah.
They dig up mummies still. There are so many mummies that all of the museums in Egypt are full. They've got like stairwells with mummies stacked in them because they just keep finding them. The most famous mummy of all is King Tut. His mummy is sent around on museum tours, and they've done x-rays of King Tut's body to see what's inside the mummy. And his mummification process was probably one of the most elaborate. They went through the standard mummification process, but then wrapped in the linens, he's got jewels and amulets. He has an extremely detailed funerary mass. This was to really make sure everybody knew this was King Tut. And his mummy is also pretty famous because it was x-rayed in 1968 to look at the internal structures of his mummy and to find out the cause of death. In 2005, it was given a CAT scan to get more accurate forensic reconstruction of the body and the face, and to get more information on how he died. And when they found that he didn't really have any indications of long-term disease. And there was also a really neat placement of the embalming incision, as well as 2 different levels of resin inside of his skull. And they think that because of that, his initial mummification was carried out by somebody who didn't really know what they were doing. It was somebody who was new at it. A lot of study done on his mummy to learn about not just the mummification process, but also about ancient Egyptians in particular, and what happened to Egyptians after death and what they did to them. One other thing they found out, he had a traumatic injury to his head after death, so probably someone accidentally dropped him. Whoops.
Somebody lost their job that day.
I'm sure. It seems like there were a lot of issues that happened during his mummification process that were mistakes or errors that happened during the process. And so I'm sure a lot of people lost their jobs.
Because he was like 19 or something when he died, right?
Yeah, he was 19, but he's known as the boy king or child king because they think that he became a king right around when he was 10. And his mummy is famous, and he is famous as a king because his tomb was the most complete tomb that anybody had ever found. They found, like I said, everything in his tomb. They found boats, they found chariots, they found mummified servants, they found food, they found dining tables, dining implements, everything he would need for his life in the afterlife. That's all I got. Famous mummies and religious mummies.
Before I started researching this, I sometimes wondered, why does England have so many ghost stories? Like, why are Victorian ghost stories such a meme? And now I know. It's because they fucking deserve the ghosts. So if you take one thing away from this episode, don't let Europeans near mummies. Why did people want to eat mummies? Really, the explanations aren't going to be satisfying? They come up with fake mystical reasons to pillage and eat people? But these are the reasons that I found. One came from the Christian traditions. Back in Victorian times, it was more widely believed that the Earth was 4,000 to 6,000 years old, kind of in line with the Bible, that we were living on a young Earth, and a bunch of people from the Christian tradition believed that, well, these ancient people that were buried thousands of years ago, they might have been from the first line of humans, some of the first humans to be created. And according to young Earth beliefs, humans were more quote-unquote pure in the early times, and that's why Noah lived hundreds of years, apparently according to the Bible. So they thought that, well, if I eat one of these pure early humans that lived for hundreds of years, maybe that will give me longevity.
People are dumb.
Oh, yeah.
These guys are pure. Better eat them.
In other circles, a similar but less connected to Christianity explanation was used. They kind of made up stories about the mummy bodies. Like, I don't think any of these European merchants did heavy research into the bodies they were buying from Egypt. Somebody would come to their shop, say that person was a businessman. He would say, well, this sample of mummy comes from a rich Egyptian merchant from 2,000 years ago, so if you want to be a successful businessman, let me sell you some of this merchant's powder. And that will make you successful. Same for people doing sports. They would sell them, quote unquote, a piece of a warrior Egyptian to improve their fitness and physicality and stuff like that. And they'd be taking on the aspects of the person that they're eating.
I wonder how much the salespeople were just like, oh yeah, you want to do better in business? Well, this guy was great at business. And then to the next person, bits of the same mummy. Oh yeah, no, this is a woman who is really beautiful. It'll make you beautiful too. Like, I wonder how much they bought their own bullshit.
I don't know. Like, they can't be double checking on the sources of a lot of these. Maybe some, like, middleman told them that, oh, this comes from blah and this comes from this type of person. But I think a lot of it might have been just made up on the spot just to sell mummy parts.
Oh, yeah. If you're a salesperson and all you're trying to do is push the product, you're going to come with the best pitch you can possibly do. You don't want them to know that mummy dust came from Carl the Ditch Digger about 10,000 years ago. Nah, you want like one of the royals or some shit.
Imagine them then selling like a fake mummy dust where it's just like ground up burnt tree bark or something, and then somebody finding out that that's what they ate and being mad that they weren't actually eating a mummy. I just can't wrap my head around the whole thing of knowingly eating mummy.
I wanted to eat people.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of that too. Like when they started to take off, people were using just ash or like modern results of cremation or modern like pets being cremated in place of Egyptian mummies. Some people would buy the Egyptian bodies to sell, and some people would just fucking fake it.
So it could actually be Carl the Ditch Digger.
100%. There was a scandal throughout the 1700s where people would dig up recently buried people, pay the local crematorium like under the table to cremate them so they could sell them as Egyptian mummies.
That was kind of like the precursor to the resurrection men who were digging up recently deceased bodies to sell to like medical schools. That's the word I wanted.
Oh, speaking of medical schools, so the first group thought that, oh, these are old bodies from Noah's age, early Christians, early humans, so they'll give me longevity. The second group was like, if I eat an Egyptian warrior body parts, then I'll become like the warrior. The third group had, I guess, more of a medicinal justification. This medicinal justification came through a series of misunderstandings that piled on top of each other. Those ancient Arabian explorers thought that those mummies were covered in asphalt when they were actually covered in resin. They then thought that the resin preserved the mummies, which it didn't. It kept the bandages on, but it was really like the mummification process and the drying with the salt that made the preservation happen. And then the third misconception is like, well, they confused the resin doing the preserving thing with just the whole damn body of the mummy being mystical and having preserving effects. So that's how it leached into medicine. Oh, I thought it was asphalt. Oh, maybe that asphalt is resin. Oh, that resin has preservative properties. Oh, maybe the whole damn mummy has preservative properties. Led to Europeans starting to consume mummies to extend their life and give them life force. And that series of misconceptions began the golden age of Europeans being vampires. Well, vampires aren't really accurate. The most accurate word is ghouls. Coming from ancient Middle Eastern legends, the ghoul is a type of human that consumes flesh. Ghouls are known to be gravediggers, tomb raiders, and former humans turned cannibal monsters. So the Europeans, by definition, were turning into ghouls at this point.
I'd say that's accurate.
So let's start with mummy medicine. Now, the earliest accounts of mummy medicine came from the 1100s. People digging up mummies, unwrapping them, grinding them into a fine powder, and using that to make medicine. This is used as base ingredient for mummy-based medicine known as mummia, and it's basically what it says on the tin, like ground up mummies put in some type of medium and used to add to other things to make it into mummy medicine. It would be put into cakes, teas, biscuits, smokable powders, pills.
I hate the idea of a mummy cake.
I mean, you could always just sprinkle a little bit of mummy dust into your next joint just to give it that extra kick.
You know that head-on applied directly to the forehead commercial?
Yes.
That's basically what a lot of the mummy medicine, what its logic was. Basically, if your head hurt, you would put the mummy medicine on your head. If your knee hurt, you put it on your knee. It's kind of like a proximity lotion type thing. Or if you eat it, it's just, it'll know what part of the body's hurting and it'll go to it.
Like fucking Vicks. Vicks on everything.
Or ginger ale.
Yeah.
It was so in vogue that even Shakespeare wrote about it. In Macbeth, he said, "Your followers have swallowed you like mummia, and being sick with such unnatural and horrid physic, vomit up you in the kennel." So even, like, it was vogue enough for Shakespeare to drop it. He was like, in his time, 1700s KFC Twitter, you know?
Based Shakespeare.
By the end of the 1700s, mummies being used to make medicine fell out of practice. Some doctors would continue it, some citizens would continue it, but like it as a popular practice went down. And the reason it was falling out of vogue is because, like, in 1796, by the end of the 1700s, the vaccine for smallpox was coming out. Nitrous oxide was being used as a painkiller. We were starting, like, to do no shit actual surgery and stuff. So, like, medicine was progressing, so not as many people were relying on mummia. But it became popular for another reason. Napoleon invaded Egypt and brought a bunch of archaeologists with him, and he basically pillaged the entire country and dragged a bunch of shit back to France, and that started this new hip age of Egypt being in vogue. We complain a lot about, like, Russia invading Ukraine, but, like, imagine this is the same shit that's happening in the 1700s. Another country is invading for no reason except conquest and supremacy, and robbing them all of all their shit, killing a bunch of people, and basically stripping their culture of a bunch of artifacts and taking it back to Europe. And because of this event of Napoleon invading and annexing Egypt, Egyptology became this, like, new hipster thing with the upper classes, and it led to a bunch of disrespectful behavior. If you're a rich Victorian, you might just take a summer vacation to Egypt, and I'm going to call it Rob a Tomb Summer Vacation, because that's exactly what it was. There was travel companies that would conduct this for you, and basically you would pay to go to Egypt, and you would be able to chip off some rock, take an artifact home if you pay a little extra. People going on these vacations would come back with enough stuff to furnish their house, so they could see that, oh, I'm a hip modern Victorian with a bunch of stolen Egyptian stuff on my walls. This kind of gives you a view of, like, how these Victorians viewed it. This is Ferdinand de Garambe from 1833. He was a Catholic monk, an aristocrat. He was like a culture writer of the time. Like, he kind of wrote about what was cool and what was in vogue and what the hip culture was up to. And this is his quote about these Robotomb summer vacations. It would hardly be respectable on one's return from Egypt to present oneself in Europe without a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other. So he was basically saying, like, hey, if you go on one of these Rob Egypt summer vacations, you're wasting your time if you don't come home with somebody's body and a crocodile.
I mean, sounds legit.
No kidding.
I wonder if they just didn't realize that, the tombs and whatnot that they were robbing were not an infinite resource, or if they just really didn't care and they're like, oh, better get there first before they're all robbed.
If you want their perspective, and this kind of shows you what the colonialist mindset is sort of like, the way they wrote about it, they thought they were rescuing these artifacts. They said, oh, these Egyptians, who they thought of as below them, don't have the education or the sophistication or the technology to take care of their own culture, so we're going to take it off their head.
Jeez.
That's how they wrote about it. It's just disrespectful colonialist attitudes, racism and bigotry that said, like, these artifacts are better off with us than with them.
The original White Knights.
Never mind that, they practiced the mummification and created these artifacts.
It's extremely colonialist. They still believe that to today. There's a lot of stuff that they won't give back to the Greeks because they think, well, the Greeks are poor, they're in debt, so they couldn't possibly take care of their own antiquities, so we're just going to take care of them for you. Yeah. And it's the same with Egypt. I mean, there's an ancient Egyptian obelisk in the middle of Central Park. New York refuses to give back because it's ours now. Finders keepers.
Ain't that the shit?
Stuff the British Stole is a really good podcast where they're exploring, the various artifacts and stuff that are currently in England, and the people who they were stolen from are working to try to get them back, and it's varying degrees of success.
But I mean, it's still the idea that we're all too savage to have our own stuff back because there's no possible way we could take care of it. It's just like that. That's my stuff. You stole it, and that doesn't mean that you can be the arbiter of who can take care of it.
Another type was Victorian unwrapping parties. So
what?
Hundreds of
That's like those fucking was that MLM with the pearls where they like open the pearls.
It's like loot boxes. Yeah, it's like mystery loot boxes.
Welcome back to my unwrapping party.
It's like a Tupperware party, except you get haunted afterwards. Hundreds of these parties occurred year-round around Europe and the Americas, which include Canada. We had parties of these all around Canada. They started out as being study sessions for universities. So it was just universities doing this at first, and all the students would observe this mummy being unwrapped. But soon it began to devolve into like these weird Victorian noblest parties of like the upper crust of the culture. And let's picture what one of these parties would be like. So you arrive in the early evening in your best dressed clothes. This is the kind of party where you drag out the big hats in the closet. You arrive, the mayor is there, local celebrities and politicians are there, and droves of European Egyptologists are there. You drink wine, you eat finger foods, and you wait for the main event. The Egyptologists line up around the table with a still-wrapped mummy shipped from Egypt on top of it, and they begin to unwrap it and cut the bandages without skill or care. Like Miriam said, some of these high-class burials would include amulets and little, like, spell scrolls and stuff like that. When they unwrapped one of these, they would give it off to members of the party so everybody could have, like, a little token of the party to take home with them. It was considered exciting because you never knew what kind of amulets you would get, you never knew what the body would look like when you get to the bottom. And when the mummy is fully unwrapped, they would often take cuttings of this mummy and make some, like, quick mummy tea or, like, give parts of the mummy away. You might go home with like a mummy toe or something like that attending these parties.
You mentioned finger foods. Were these the mummy's fingers, or where did they get the fingers?
Well, start of the party, it was like lady fingers, like actual like baked goods and like little hors d'oeuvres. But by the end of the party, some of these parties, it sounded like it might have literally been mummy fingers. Like they would make them into a quick tea, or like I saw some descriptions of them Victorians just taking a little bite off of the mummy, like just eating it right there, freshly unwrapped.
I don't think we pay enough attention to how horrifying the Victorians are. I'm learning so much more about it now, and it's upsetting. It's upsetting.
It's very upsetting.
It gets worse.
Yeah, this is why Britain is on fire right now.
Yeah.
This next one, I think, is like the quickest way to get haunted. Like, if you're looking for speed hauntings, this is the way to do it. Mummy brown paint.
Oh no.
Does anyone want to guess what that is?
It's paint made of mummy bits.
Bullseye. You grind up a mummy and you make it into paint, and then you paint something with it. If you want to look up the painting, Liberty Leading the People, that uses mummy brown paint. The cover art for Coldplay's Viva La Vida, that's the same painting. Used mummy brown paint. It was used to paint paintings, or sometimes the inside of houses, or prayer rooms, or nurseries. And they thought it would provide like some protective element because you're using part of like this ancient Egyptian body to protect a space. I think it did the exact opposite of that. I think if I got ground up and I was used to paint somebody's walls, I would want to haunt that fellow. Also, this was used up until 1964, and this is only when it stopped officially being made. There's still lots of like gray and black market sources to buy mummy brown paint made of mummies, and probably a lot of modern corpses as well, like disguised as mummies. So this is still going on. People are still painting their walls with dead people.
That's very upsetting.
Yeah, on the one hand, it's really screwed up. On the other side, it's kind of metal because this is obviously how we bring magic items back into the world.
Oh yeah, every one of these is a cursed item, though. Not even the pets of Egypt got away scot-free being disrespected by the Europeans. Like Miriam said, for middle-class and above burials, sometimes lower-class burials, if you save the extra money, you could get some of your pets preserved with you. Cats and dogs were the most numerous, but there was also pet hawks and falcons and monkeys and snakes and horses and all that stuff. So the super respectful thing that Europeans did to the beloved pets and animals of ancient Egypt was buy them in bulk and grind them up and use them for fertilizer. For several hundred years, a big source of European fertilizer was ground up Egyptian pets.
Was it even an effective fertilizer? Because I guess I don't know that much about fertilizer, but I don't know what it would be that would be that useful.
I think it does something for the soil, but yeah, and it was used in mass. There's one account of a single European farming company purchasing 180,000 mummified cats to be ground up into the soil, and that's for one harvest season. So 180,000 mummified cats for one harvest season of one company.
That's too many cats.
Wow.
In the late 1800s, the demand for mummies was so great that the bodies of homeless people, criminals, or even animals were used to make mummies. So this is kind of like when it started to get late and it was still kind of booming. They would make fake corpses. They would buy people that couldn't afford to get buried. They would steal the bodies, and people that couldn't afford a proper burial, or sometimes they would stalk a graveyard and dig up like a freshly buried corpse just to be used to make into fake mummies to enter the market. Another thing that mummies are used for, it turns out that a lot of the Catholic saints, a lot of like, oh, we have the hand of Joan of Arc. Oh, we have Sister blah 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 from the 1500s preserved in our church. She was almost made a saint. A lot of those bodies, when tested, have proven to be Egyptian mummy bodies disguised as Catholic saints.
That seems sacrilegious.
Or is it sacrilegious?
Oh, yeah.
By the late 1800s, more of society started to see grave robbing and even robbing of ancient Egyptian graves as rude.
Rude.
It didn't stop.
Oh, sure. Finally.
And when I say rude, I don't mean like the whole culture like turned against it. It was like it was more like 80% of people thought it wasn't rude, and now like 80% of people think it's rude by that point. But to this day, a lot of the stuff still goes on. The last unwrapping party done in public was in 1908. A lot of journalist publications at that time like took a negative view of it. Oh, this is like so disrespectful. I think the best thing to come out of this mummy craze is in 1999, The Mummy, featuring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, cast an ancient Egyptian spell to awaken the sexuality of millions of its viewers. So I think that's the one piece of good light that can come of this.
Really the greatest movie of all time.
Yes.
Oh, 100%.
Of all time.
But yeah, that's why you shouldn't let Europeans near mummies. Bottom line, this is an interesting episode, but like Miriam said, there's a lot of stolen Egyptian shit and shit from all the different cultures that were robbed that needs to be returned. Like, what are we doing with it? There's an obelisk in New York?
In Central Park. Just hanging out there from ancient Egypt, and nobody wants to give it back.
Fuck that.
Well, it's ours now. We stole it fair and square.
Bottom line, there's a lot of Egyptian shit that needs to be returned. Like, we've stopped in large part eating their dead. Maybe the least we can do is like return all the shit we stole? Maybe?
Okay.
Baby steps.
Jesus Christ.
That's all I got. Does anybody else have anything else?
If you want to purchase a tube of mummy brown off of Amazon, it's $104.
Oh, I hate that.
Jesus Christ. More reasons for me not to support Jeff. Good. For Occultae Veritatis, I've been Ood Gallifrey. And co-hosting this episode with me, I had
Miriam.
And in distance recording with me, we had
Thievery.
Squishy.
Misfit.
And Brannigan.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night. See you the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Playing us out this episode, we have all the way back in 1926, only 4,400 years after the Golden Age of Mummies, Louis Armstrong and his song, Heebie-Jeebies. See you in the after show. An update to our Unification Church cult episode. Would you believe that it's connected to the assassination of the President of Japan? Now, none of this is confirmed, because investigations are still ongoing, but the Unification Church is known for welcoming people into the cult, and then pressuring them heavily to donate to the church. Sometimes substantial amounts, sometimes amounts that end up financially ruining or bankrupting those that donate. And what do they promise? Spiritual enlightenment, of course. Give us all of your earthly belongings, and we will give you spiritual enlightenment, the pitch of all cults. The man who murdered the President of Japan, Tetsuya Yamagami, stated that the primary factor that made him decide to murder the president was the president's involvement in the Unification Church, an organization that financially ruined his mother. The president did have connections with the Unification Church, going so far as having him donate to Unification Church events, sending congratulations and public accommodation for Unification Church activities, and maintaining ongoing friendly relationships with members of the cult and friends that were members of the cult. We covered this cult all the way back in case number 6, one of our first episodes, single digits. If you would have told me back then, this little cult that we covered in case number 6 would, in some part, lead to the death of the President of Japan, I wouldn't have believed you, but here we are. Strange little world we live in. Investigation is ongoing. If I find any updates as to the President having deeper relations with the cult, I'll report on that. But for now, that's your Unification Church cult update. I hope you're having a happy October. A little episode about a core that is demonic is coming up next, and there's going to be a Halloween special where we're going to take a trip around the world and explore a certain class of monsters. Look for that on October 25th. You're all going to enjoy it. For now, remember to add some fiber to your diet. Grunting on the toilet is a good way to get a brain aneurysm. And until next time, I love you. And thank you for tuning in, and we'll come back next week for some more interesting bullshit. Bye-bye.